ask a little question before I give the microphone to the room, because it's still something I don't understand since this afternoon. It's clear that this is a political case. I mean, I got this, but what I don't get is that the judges, they play this political game. I mean, this is still not entering my mind. Maybe you can, go into this, and I will give the microphone to the room afterwards. Thank you.
Well, it really comes down to the US-UK extradition treaty is a piece of legislation that was introduced right after 9/11. It does very much what the European arrest warrant does. It fast tracks extraditions. But in addition to that, because the idea was, that it was going to be used for terrorism cases. But then it just immediately was used for any old extradition. And not only does it fast track it and really constrain the judges from looking into the case, it's also very uneven. So, for example, the US has no obligation and doesn't present any prima facie evidence in its extradition request. The extradition request rests on statements by prosecutors. Those statements you cannot cross-examine them directly. They're arguing against a piece of paper. But still, there are bars to extradition. I mean, a very obvious bar to extradition. And some of you might be thinking, how on earth has this extradition even got this far? If you're a little bit familiar with extradition treaties and so on, a general bar to extradition is for political offenses. And political offenses where the state is the victim. So obviously the Espionage Act, these are things like treason, sedition, espionage, and so on. The use of the Espionage Act in itself should bar extradition. The argument of the US is that the publication harmed US national interests. So the victim is the state. Of course, the publication in the context of war is political in itself. I mean, in a sense, the act of speech is political. You cannot have a blanket protection unless you want to undo the entire system of democratic accountability. So the United States issued an extradition request for 17 charges under the Espionage Act. This should have been thrown out of the courts, right? How did they go around that? Well, the Extradition Act does not incorporate political offenses as a bar to extradition. So the domestic legislation did not make any mention of political offenses. And so the British judge said that the treaty bar, the treaty exclusion, is not enforceable in domestic courts. I mean, effectively you have both the US and the UK violating their own extradition treaty. The US for having issued it, and the UK for having acted on, not throwing it out from the beginning. But then there are other aspects to the political. So there's the bare political offense, the Espionage Act, and there's a political motivation. The political motivation is important to understand because the indictment against Julian was only brought in March 2018 under the Trump administration, and it served a purpose. During the Obama administration, Julian was not indicted over the Chelsea Manning publications. And in fact, the Obama administration commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence. And there was a Department of Justice spokesperson that explained the rationale why Julian would not be prosecuted over these same publications that he's now prosecuted under. And that was what they called the New York Times problem. It was a recognition by the Obama administration that if they brought a case against Julian, there was no way of doing that without setting the precedent for the rest of the press, because they couldn't find a way to differentiate him from the rest of the press. Because the crime is receiving, possessing, communicating information to the public. And of course, that's what is done all the time. You might say, well, but it was national defense information. Well, actually, the New York Times publishes national defense information all the time, every single day. As does all of your newspapers, and, you know, every single day. Yeah. So, okay, the political motivation. The Trump administration, as you will remember, was plagued by leaks. It was probably the most vigorous press moment in US presidential history, maybe apart from the Nixon era. There were leaks all the time in the Washington Post, New York Times. Someone had sat in a meeting with Trump and he said this, or there was this document there. And of course, Trump was, and the Trump administration went absolutely ballistic with this, and then decided that they were going to clamp down on the leaks. And Trump was even cited as having said that the sources should be, in relation to one of the leaks, should be executed. And so, how do you go after, if you're a government that wants to basically stop leaks, i.e. Censor the press? How do you go about that? Well, they used the Espionage Act to go after sources. For example, Daniel Hale, who in 2014, I think, revealed how drone warfare actually is in practice. He was a drone operator, and he disclosed that 9 out of 10 kills in a drone bombing are civilians. They get the target, but then they get 9 others as well. And this is the average. And he leaked this to The Intercept, and then he was not prosecuted under the Obama administration, but then the Trump administration came in and convicted him under the Espionage Act. And but the Trump administration went even further. So you intimidate the press, bully the press, you tell the press what you're doing is a crime and we can come after you any moment. It becomes completely selective because it's being done all the time. You go after the source and you also go after the publisher. So the precedent that has been set with Julian's case is by extending the culpability of the source to the recipient of the information who then publishes it. And that's why there's a very important difference between the two. The political motivation of this indictment was, part of the purpose was to be able to set a precedent through which they could go after the press more generally. There's a conversation between the FBI director, Comey, and Donald Trump, in which they talk about putting a head on the spike in relation to these big leaks that Trump, during the Trump era. And Julian is the head on a spike. He was prosecuted, he's been prosecuted, not because there was a New York Times problem, but because for the Trump administration, it was the New York Times solution. It enables the US administration to be able to bring a case. And the effect of this is that the Washington Post, New York Times, and everyone else, of course, no longer publish the most hard-hitting news, because it goes to their in-house lawyers, and the in-house lawyers say, we can't publish this anymore because of the Assange precedent. And we know this because the Washington Post and New York Times have put out editorials saying this case has to be dropped because it is affecting, because it is inhibiting our ability to do our jobs. And that's the reality, that these stories are being kept from the public because the legal advice that these newsrooms are getting is you cannot publish this because you risk prison, you risk years in a courtroom, you risk, spending a lot of money on lawyers, etc. It's just not worth it.
Thank you. I will come down if... Okay. Yes, somebody wants the microphone.
Thank you for the explanations you gave us. You have been invited by a parliamentary group here in Luxembourg. Have you had the opportunity to meet a member of the government, and what did they say about it? Thank you.
Yes, I was invited by the parliamentary group, and I have not met with the government. I have not requested to meet with the government on this occasion. I have met with the German government and the Norwegian government, and I would welcome a meeting with the Luxembourgish government.
Maybe I can add that in the parliament this afternoon there were representatives of the coalition, member of parliaments from the party Green and Socialist. I also informed the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but well, of course no answer, but there was also one representative of his ministry who was there in parliament, of the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs.
Hello. Also, thank you very much for coming here today. Also, my question was, when Julian Assange was in Ecuador embassy during the Rafael Correa presidency, there was the election. It was possible that maybe when Rafael Correa was not there, the new president is maybe red will decided to say Julian Assange to go out. Why Julian Assange and you don't take this position about that? Maybe if the new president comes, you will go. Why you don't take this position about that?
Sorry, why didn't we take what position?
I mean, when Julian Assange was in embassy during the Rafael Correa presidency, also there was election, and then maybe it was possible that Rafael Correa is not more in the power. Maybe the new presidency will come, is a friend of America. During the election, why you don't take precaution to say, okay, we have to think if the new president come, if he's not friends of Julian Assange, maybe he will accept that go out. Why during that time election we don't take precaution to see if you stay in embassy or will go before the coming of the new presidency?
Well, it was the Ecuadorian government under Lenin Moreno who succeeded Correa's government. Engaged in deception. They claimed to continue to protect Julian as far as in terms of formally, they would say that they would continue to protect Julian, that they wouldn't force him out and all these things. There was also a ruling by the Inter-American Court, an advisory opinion that made their ability to expel him more difficult, more clear-cut, that they would be violating international law. So even though I think that delayed things, maybe they were going to expel him in 2018, but there was this ruling by the Inter-American Court. Julian tried to go to the to the Ecuadorian courts, but it was too politicized. I didn't get anywhere, but he did go to the Inter-American Commission and asked the Inter-American Commission to intercede. And he was saying, look, there are all these indications that the Ecuadorian government is basically secretly striking a deal with the United States, that they're implementing all these measures inside the embassy to make it extremely difficult for him to be able to live there, basically cutting off his internet, cutting off his phones, saying he couldn't meet anyone, forcing him to be in isolation during the weekend from Friday 5 o'clock to Monday 9 a.m., petty harassment by the security guards and so on. And the Inter-American Court came back and said, well, Ecuador, if you're going to remove his asylum, you can't just do it like that. You have to allow a process. And Ecuador went, oh, we're not going to remove his asylum. And then they removed his asylum. And they also, they did it like this, they called him into the meeting room. They said, you no longer have diplomatic political asylum. The British police are waiting for you in the next room. And your Ecuadorian nationality is suspended because in the constitution you're not allowed to hand over an Ecuadorian national. They just did it. And this is what, you see, if a case of this is so political, countries like the United Kingdom and Ecuador have shown that they will just violate international conventions and then deal with the consequences if there are any. On the day that Julian was officially granted political asylum, which was the 16th of August 2012, there was a big police presence outside the embassy, and there were many photographers, obviously, and lots of people, and there was going to be a big announcement. And the day before, the United Kingdom had given a letter to Ecuador, privately, diplomatically, saying that they were going to come into the embassy, that they would violate the diplomatic immunity of the embassy. And Ecuador, rather than recoil and submit, made a big announcement and made this letter public, and then had the condemnation of the entire organization of Latin American states, the OAS. And so it didn't work. This act of such blatant intimidation didn't work. Ecuador was defiant, and the next day they announced Julian had been officially granted this status. Now, on that day, there was all these crowds gathered outside. Julian came out on the balcony, but one of the members of the press had a big, it's called one of these magnifying lenses, and took a picture of a notepad that one of the police who was around the embassy had in his hand, and of course was able to zoom in and captured his instructions. And the instructions were, arrest Assange, even if he's in a diplomatic vehicle, even if he's in a diplomatic bag, strangely, you arrest him. So that's a clear instruction to violate the Vienna Convention. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because they're prepared to violate the law. And then maybe there will be consequences. So in relation to specifically Ecuador, you have to realize that Julian's presence in the embassy, that was the only thing protecting him from imprisonment. And then eventually the embassy became a prison in itself. But what we have since learned during this time during the Trump presidency, one of his most unhinged members of government was the head of the CIA, Mike Pompeo. And Mike Pompeo was absolutely obsessed with bringing down Julian and WikiLeaks while he was head of the CIA. Now there's this investigation that came out in September 2021, published by 3 national security journalists who were based in Washington, D.C., with long established careers in national security journalism. And they had interviewed over 30 individuals who were members of the CIA or the National Security Council under the Trump administration. And they said that they testified to how Pompeo was obsessed, not only obsessed with Julian, but hatching plans about how to bring WikiLeaks down. Of course, it's not just about Julian, it's about silencing WikiLeaks. And that's partly because WikiLeaks had published about the CIA. The biggest leak in CIA history was published in the early months of the Trump administration by WikiLeaks. So Pompeo had discussions in the White House about how about potentially killing Julian, and he also ordered his agency, the CIA, to come up with what the report describes as sketches and options about how to assassinate Julian inside the embassy. There was a whole CIA operation to silence Julian. And the assassination plans, according to this report, were quashed basically at the National Security Council level. They didn't go any further. But there were discussions with the British counterparts about what would happen if he left the embassy, that they would ram the car even if it was a diplomatic car. There was, I mean, the article is just incredible, because there talks about how they were talking about shooting the tires off a plane if he got in a plane. It wasn't just these extreme plans that were being hatched. It was also, planting stories in the media and so on. But the thing is, you would say, well, the story, surely it's too extreme, it can't be true. Well, then you have something unexpected that completely mirrors and corroborates this report. And that is that when Julian was arrested, there were 3 whistleblowers who came out in Spain. Now, these 3 whistleblowers had been working for the security company inside the embassy of Ecuador. They were Spanish nationals, and the thing is that Ecuador, because it didn't have great relations with the UK in part, but not just because of Julian, Ecuadorians have to get visas in order to work in the UK, and so it was easier for Ecuador to just outsource security to a Spanish private security company called UC Global. Now, UC Global was corrupt and anything you can imagine, and composed of basically ex-mercenaries, some nice people too, You know, I've met some sweet guys there, but also some just the kind of the caricature of the mercenary. They were there too, and these people were supposedly guarding the embassy. And over the 7 years that Julian was there, it was very clear in the beginning that their role was to guard the embassy. By the end of it, they were basically there to harass and spy on Julian. And anyway, 3 of these guys within this private security company then became whistleblowers once Julian was arrested, and went first to El País and then to Spanish prosecutors and handed over hard disks of information that they had been gathering while they were spying on Julian. They weren't just spying on Julian, they were spying on his legal meetings with his lawyers, discussing where he discussed legal strategy concerning potential extradition and trial in the United States. The microphones were placed hidden inside, under the fire extinguisher in the meeting room. They also bugged the women's toilet, because Julian didn't trust the meeting room and eventually used the women's toilet for meetings because it was bigger, but they also bugged that. One of the security operatives took me aside in December 2017 and told me that that he had instructions to steal the nappy of our 6-month-old baby. And why do you think he had these instructions? They wanted our 6-month-old baby's DNA to be able to establish Julian's paternity. Now, this is the agency that part of its mandate is assassinations. Not within the United States, supposedly, but everywhere else. And at that stage, that's when I stopped bringing the baby into the embassy, obviously, because he told me it wasn't safe. And he said they're asking us to do very strange things. So I knew from December 2017 that things were extremely sinister and not safe. And I feared, even though I didn't know at that point, that assassination was on the cards. So one of the things that these security company guys revealed when they went to the Spanish authorities was that they had discussed the possibility of poisoning Julian inside the embassy. They had also discussed the possibility of leaving the door open so that he could, well, basically so he could be kidnapped deniably. So the door was open and we were in a different part of the embassy and he's gone. And so on. And this case in Spain is, well, it's before a magistrate in Madrid. And this magistrate has asked for Mike Pompeo to appear, to testify. Mike Pompeo writes about this in his book. He doesn't say it's about Julian, but he says that this is an example of the harassment that he's been suffering because of his work as CIA director. So this judge in Madrid has asked for Mike Pompeo to appear before the Spanish authorities to explain whether there's any truth to it. And of course, Mike Pompeo has not complied. But the CIA has not denied these reports. Mike Pompeo basically confirmed, because when the story came out, this 7,000-word report, he said that the sources, these 30 sources, they should all be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Of course, Espionage Act concerns the disclosure of national defense information, so it's not a libel case, it's not about disclosing lies, it's about disclosing truths. So here again, you have this case is so extreme that you have not just circumstantial, but extremely grave accusations of a conspiracy to murder a journalist on European soil by a foreign power, and yet the British courts have given have basically refused to engage. With the Spanish investigation, they say, well, it's up to a Spanish judge, there are no conclusions yet, we have to wait for a ruling, so we don't have to engage yet. And then, you know, even with Pompeo's, you know, effective confirmation and so on, the intrinsics of this case are just so clear that I can't explain it myself, that this is going on in broad daylight, you know. It's just so, it's all out there.
Yes, two questions. You said it's a political thing in the United States, and you spoke about Trump administration and also Obama administration. Now with Biden administration, is there a change? Do you think they will do the things different? That's my first question. And the second question is, we spoke also about freedom of speech. These last years were also not so easy for journalists and for people. How can we guarantee that? How can we also help Julian Assange in this battle?
Sorry, can you wave, because I don't see where you were. Oh, there, okay. Well, the Biden administration isn't any better. Like, they should have dropped it. This is a Trump administration legacy. There are certainly people within the US administration that are happy that Julian's silenced and imprisoned. And he's imprisoned in a way that it's very comfortable for the United States, because the United States says, oh, well, the UK is imprisoning him. Of course, the UK is imprisoning him because the US is trying to extradite him, but they don't say this. It's not us. And then the UK says, well, it's not us. We don't have any charges against him. It's the US that want him. We have to comply. But this is now, the case is reaching a conclusion. And now, even if Julian is successful in winning the extradition, the case, say, before the European Court of Human Rights, if that happens, that's a bad outcome for the UK and the US. It's just not a good look, you know, to have a European court, if Julian's successful. I don't think that the US and the UK have really thought through, beyond the immediate convenience of Julian's imprisonment, the implications and for their own long-term interest. For the Biden administration, the press doesn't, you know, the press is opposed to this prosecution for self-interested reasons, and also because it is absolutely outrageous, which everyone can see. But they have their own interest in saying that this case should be dropped. So it pits the Biden administration against the press at a high level, you know, not... I wouldn't say the US press is talking about this case all the time, but if Julian were to be extradited, then it would suddenly become, you know, a burning issue. But it's just not convenient for the Biden administration in the middle of an election to have an adversarial relationship with the press, more of an adversarial relationship. For the UK, you know, the UK, because it's the UK that's imprisoning him, they're the most visible evildoer in this case, because they're allowing it to continue, because they're enforcing this this atrocity and so on. It's really not in the UK's interest to continue doing this. So I think there's a degree of bureaucratic inertia. Of course, you have the US prosecutors that are trying to make a career for themselves. But within the US administration, the Biden administration, just like there was in the Trump administration and the Obama administration, there's a lot of controversy around this case because it has never put, it has never exposed the First Amendment, the freedom of speech provision in the US Constitution under such great threat of being undermined, because it completely, so maybe I should explain what the First Amendment is in the United States. It's not like Article 10 here, the freedom of expression. It's a lot stronger. The First Amendment doesn't grant a right. What it does is restrict the US legislature, the US government, from restricting speech. They cannot legislate to restrict speech. It's like a free speech absolutism. It's very strong and it's survived, hundreds of years. But this is the biggest threat there's ever been against the First Amendment. Of course, in Europe we have weaker protections. They're not as absolute. But still protections that clearly should be protecting Julian. So it's always been controversial. That's the reason Obama didn't want to go there, because it would put the First Amendment at risk. Under the Trump administration, 2 of the prosecutors who were working on Julian's case got taken off the case. This was reported, I think, in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. They were taken off the case when the Espionage Act charges were brought because they disagreed. Under the Biden administration, there is certainly also disagreement about this. It's not like we're dealing with a monolith, because this case is inherently controversial, is inherently political. And I think this is maybe lost on some of the European governments, that this is actually a very weak case and very internally controversial case in the United States. And it's something that the Australian government has come to understand, though. So the Australian government says enough is enough, he's suffered enough, he should be released, and so on. And Australia just sent a delegation of parliamentarians to the United States to call for the case to be dropped. I forgot the second part of your question. It's freedom of expression. I think, look, Julian's case is so important for freedom of expression because it really marks a departure from what has been before. It's not just about his freedom of expression. The prosecution is linked to the exposure of war crimes. You can have a clearer case. And the problem, of course, is that it creates a new environment in which, the same principle is being applied to others. So, in order to increase that space for freedom of expression, for freedom of the press, you can't do that without freeing Julian. He is the case that could potentially change course on the global kind of contraction of freedom of the press, freedom of speech. You can't have Julian extradited and put on trial in the United States and hope for an improvement here. It's the opposite. It gets narrower and narrower and narrower.
Thank you very much to the organizers and also to Stella for being here. My question is that we're looking at the rise of the far right across Europe, the normalization of hate speech, xenophobic or racist discourses by the media and politicians. For example, this Saturday we had in the Gar a manifestation, a protest that was also regarding security and cleanness and somehow the criminalization of homelessness, drug addiction, and etc. So we are looking at it very close. There's a big silence, even by, I believe, the general public organizations. Can you please tell us what to expect in such an atmosphere? Or how do you perceive this rise of the far right? Thank you.
It's difficult for me to answer without really understanding the local context. I think there is if you suppress, look, the question is why is there a rise? You have to look at the causes and why is it getting any purchase? And I think it's an extremely worrying development that things are so polarized and extremely just a general sense of things becoming very unstable and unpredictable. And I'm very pessimistic about where Europe is. Sorry.
Merci. Nathalie, kannst du uns übersetzen, geht das? Ich würde gerne wissen, wie Medien, Journalisten oder Editeuren sich an all den Jahren, wie die sich entwickelt haben, par rapport zu der Situation von Julian Assange. Ja, ganz kurz, was die Luxemburger Situation anbelangt. Die Friedensplattform hat eine Reihe Protestmanifestationen für unsere britische Ambassade zu Lützeburg gemacht. Bei der ersten haben wir uns an Journalisten gewandt, weil wir gedacht haben, sie könnten solidarisch mit uns sein, für sich für ihre Kollegen von ihnen anzusetzen. Und sie haben das nicht gemacht. Ich muss aber so, bei der zweiten Protestmanifestation haben sie das gemacht. Sie waren nicht selber da, aber sie haben das über den Solidaritätsschreiben gemacht. Bislang also das so, dass ich meine nicht, dass zu Lützeburg von den Journalisten selber Initiativen ausgehen, also über hier beruflich erwischt, also als die Sachen, die K abgreifen, rausgehen. Wenn ich aber eigentlich denke, dass sie müssten solidarisch sind, bin ich froh, wie es das an anderen Länder. Denkt man nämlich darunter, dass den Julian Assange aber innerhalb von den Journalisten ein Star war. Und dann vielleicht, also interessant, darüber anzugehen, was für eine Rolle das The Guardian an dem Kontext gespielt hat. Merci.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, I'm pleased to say that I did an interview with RTL this afternoon, and Bocht, and I'm doing another interview tomorrow. So hopefully that's changing, and I think look, there's just been there's a bit of a reflex because this case is a bit complex, very complex, there are many aspects to it, and so I think to be a little bit non-judgmental about it. I think for the vast majority, it's just that there's a lack of awareness, really, on the implications for the freedom of the press. Because, you know, you have to have an analysis of the US Espionage Act. You don't have to, but like, you know, you look into it and there's a US Espionage Act and there's the UK with its extradition, and you might fall into the trap of thinking this is something between the US and the UK. And there was a lot of, look, I think it comes down to the fact that in 2010, 2011, when these publications came out, there was this kind of general wisdom based on nothing much, which was the US will never come after Julian. If they come after Julian, they're going to have to come after the Guardian, New York Times, blah, blah, blah. They won't do it, and they'd have to criminalize journalism. And then, well, what happened? You know, 8 years passed, and then the press landscape from 2010 was completely different to the press landscape in 2018, when it was possible. And by then, the press was less cocky about it, and now they're afraid. So I think it's partly fear, which is really not in their own interests to not talk about it, because if you don't push back, then it's here to stay. And it's partly ignorance. And the ignorance, you know, is down to, yeah, you know, like Julian is a critic of the media. He spent a lot of time explaining why the media have basically talking about how the media works and its relationship with power and with advertisers and with, so, you know, with the media, is it serving just the readers? If it was serving just the readers, there would be less conflicts of interest. But the reality is that there are conflicts of interest, and that's why when Julian brought it up and talked about it and criticized it and had a very big megaphone and interest into what he was saying, he became a huge inconvenience, a huge, and also, let's face it, also the arrival to the previous model, or to this compromise, well, compromised media might be a bit extreme, but by media who have conflicts of interest because of their funding structure. So Julian was not very popular with a lot of the press for a long time, but I think that it's gone beyond that. Like, I think that there's enough subject experts on press freedom, like Reporters Without Borders and the International Federation of Journalists and so on, that have been able to focus on what matters really, which is what this case means, what the implications are, and so on, that have been able to create the kind of fundamental understanding about what the case is about and the risks and the problems. And I think the press has moved beyond Julian as a person and actually looked at what this is really about. The role of the Guardian, I mean, there's a lot on this. I spent like 20 minutes on it in the Parliament, and I think I lost a few people along the way, but yes, the Guardian, I should say the Guardian, the New York Times and so on, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, and El País put out a joint statement saying the case should be dropped, that it's an attack on press freedom and so on. So editorially, they're on side. They should be covering, not just them, but all the press should be covering this, because this is the press freedom case of the century. So obviously there should be, my standard here is, I don't know how it was in the Luxembourgish papers, but in The Guardian, when there was the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial, it was impossible to miss. It was right at the top of their website, day after day after day after day, and well, that should be the standard. You would really want to put a case in front of the eyes of the public, you put it right on top. And that is exactly what should be happening. Why is it not happening with The Guardian? Well, they have some conflicts of interest, but they have a very significant conflict of interest when it comes to Julian. And that is that they played the decisive role in the publication of the unredacted cables. They published as a headline, as a chapter heading in their telltale book about Julian, which is very nasty. One of their chapter headings was the password to the encrypted file. And it describes in excruciating detail how Julian gave the head of the investigations unit in The Guardian this password, which was a very long 26-character password with special hash and asterisks and so on, including a word that he should never write down. For security reasons. You never write down this word, but you put it here, diplomatic, before history. And it says, will you remember that? And David Lee, this Guardian investigative head, said, yes, I will remember that. He describes it in the book. And he puts the whole thing in, including the word that he should never write down. I mean, he could have just come up with a different password, something like this. But no, he put in the actual password with the word that he should never write down. And then the book. I mean, the book is incriminating. This is the thing. The Guardian doesn't want to talk about WikiLeaks because they wrote a book which led to the publication of the unredacted cables, which is incriminating, and they don't want to draw attention to it. The book says, Julian told me it was a temporary website, and then I downloaded the files and decrypted it with the password. Okay, so it was a temporary website. When this book was published, people started reading it, including security experts, who then thought, this is a password that has just been published. You never do that. You never write it down, you never repeat it, you destroy it, etc. And then we're able to track down the encrypted file on the internet, which without the password, it would take thousands of years of the most highly powered computers in the world to actually crack. So impossible to crack except if you have a password, which David Lee put into this book. The Guardian says, when asked about this, basically people on the internet then started publishing the unredacted cables because they had found the file and they found the password in the book. And then the Guardian went, oh, no. Julian said it was a temporary password. Except if you look at the book and it says temporary website. So it's just incredibly embarrassing and incriminating for the Guardian, this whole cable thing. And whenever Julian is accused of publishing the unredacted cables, it's generally people who don't understand what actually happened. Julian, when he found out that the book was out and the cables were in the wild, he tried to warn the State Department. There's a recording of the whole conversation with the State Department. And I think the Guardian doesn't want any scrutiny. That's the problem. Anything to do with Julian will bring scrutiny on the Guardian about what happened. And Julian is facing 50 years in relation to the cables alone. And there's no question about the timeline. The US recognizes they were on the internet, published by third parties. There's a testimony by John Young from Cryptome who said, I published it on the internet first of all. I was the first person to publish it. There's no dispute about what happened. But obviously, not a lot of, apart from the people look into the history. But I should say that there are very good books about all of this background that I should recommend. Niels Meltzer, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, wrote a book, The Trials of Julian Assange, a story of persecution. It's in German and French. Édition critique for the French. And then Stefania Maurizi, I think her book is also coming out in French. It's in Italian and English. It has won investigative journalism awards and so on. And she goes into, whereas Niels Meltzer goes more into the treatment of Julian and the background with how this all came about. Stefania Maurizi basically has a detailed, she's kind of reconstructed things with official documents that she's obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and so on, and has really been able to track the conversations between the UK and Sweden, and what was going on behind the scenes. And she was part of the original partnership, so she writes about basically this history, which I just explained from a first-person perspective.
It's 8:20. You must be tired. I don't know if you want to take one more question or because it's been one more. Okay, une dernière. Three together. Yeah, three together. Oh my.
Just a short one. Where do you find the strength to carry on? And with you, I mean you and Julian. Thank you.
So I have just one question, which is regarding recently European Union has put a blanket ban on so-called state-sponsored Russian media. While individual articles can be scrutinized and can be targeted legally for misinformation, the blanket ban is considered to also make certain precedents and allow for legal blanket bans, and a lot of journalists in Netherlands are going against it. What's your thought on that? regardless of, I mean, not supporting whether the content is right or wrong, but is it correct to put a blanket ban?
Since, well, you've been involved in this emblematic case, well, first as a lawyer, I think, and then sharing Julian Assange's life, I'm wondering if you, at some point, looking at the past, have thought about any decision you took, you and or Julian, and that today, well, you think you could have taken this decision differently or took different actions. Have you thought about this?
Thanks for your questions. On the, where do I find the strength? Well, I mean, I don't think of it that way. I think I just want Julian home. You know, he really should just be able to live his life. And I see a lot of people who support him, you know, from all types of people. I mean, it's given me faith in humanity, because we know that like a certain percentage of people are psychopaths, right? And maybe they tend to positions of power. But for the vast majority of I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious there, but it's also a bit true, you know. But for the vast majority of people, they have a fundamental sense of decency and what's right and wrong, and they immediately recognize, in this case, something that has been a person that has been severely wronged, and that it has to be righted, and that there is power and agency in coming together for what's right, you know. At a very minimum, you find fellow travelers who agree on some fundamentals, and that is empowering, I think, to me at least, and certainly to Julian, who I talk to about all the support there is and the actions and so on all over the world. I mean, it's a global movement. And it's no longer the case that Julian's case is marginal or a detail. When the president of Brazil brings it up in the first speech of the General Assembly and there's a spontaneous applause, that's not a marginal case. In fact, it's the very opposite. On the blanket ban, look, I'm a free speech advocate, and I do not believe that banning media is the way forward. Obviously, in times of war, there is propaganda, but the population is intelligent enough to know that. The answer is not to become the worst aspects of what you accuse your enemies of. It's a very dangerous trajectory. That's my position, because I believe that you need more speech and you need to strengthen protections rather than starting to find areas in which they can be undermined, because of course if you undermine the whole, you end up with a, it's not a whole anymore. On the doing things differently, you know, when Julian was first arrested, I thought, well, maybe we should have tried to get him out like secretly get him out. Because this was always a thought. Instead of fighting this legally, let's just try to get him to somewhere safe, like across the channel into France or something. And then we found out that Mike Pompeo was making assassination plans. So I don't think what's being done to Julian is not his doing. It is being done to him. It's not like he crossed the line. The line was there. The line was, you can publish true information even when it offends and indicts the most powerful person in the room. You're protected because it's a public service, because criminality has to be able to be exposed. And the only way of doing this is protecting the act of publishing and of disclosing criminality. You can't turn that into a crime. So he did the right thing. It's not that he did the wrong thing. He's being punished because he did the right thing. There has been a deterioration of those protections, the failure of those protections to keep him out of prison, to prevent all these extraordinary violations of his right, the bugging of his legal meetings with his lawyers where he was obtaining legal advice, the spying on our baby, etc. Those are crimes. Julian hasn't committed a crime. They committed the crimes against him, and also all the crimes that he exposed that they committed. This is a show of force, of bullying, of authoritarianism.